So now, after a lot of preliminary information on how cells work and how bacteria work and viruses work and stuff, now we're actually going to start our first body system. The neurologic system first. This is going to include a lot of peripheral neurologic disorders, but also things like sleep disorders, loss of consciousness, concussions, a number of a variety of things. It's going to take a few lectures to get through all this. I'm going to start off with a basic review of the overall layout of the nervous system. I know you had this in A&P 1, but for some of you that's been a little while, so I want to make sure we're on the same page before we go any farther with this. So, central nervous system, the brain, brain stem, spinal cord. Everything is contained within the central nervous system, surrounded by cerebrospinal fluid, not blood. The central nervous system is simply that. Within here you have the brain, the midbrain, brain stem, cerebellum, medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, which then separates out into this cauda equina at the bottom, where it's not entirely encased anymore. The final nerves are coming out in the lumbar and sacral plexes. 12 pairs of cranial nerves. That means they come straight out of the brain and they don't even enter the spinal cord before they go down. And then a lot of spinal nerves, the spinal nerves that come out at all the vertebrae, and they coalesce into plexes like the cervical plexus, the brachial plexus, the sacral plexus, lumbar plexus, and then they send out the appropriate nerves to whatever outside the central nervous system. Everything that has exited either the brain or the spinal cord becomes a peripheral nerve. You have the pathways. Most nerves have both incoming and outgoing signals, so they'll have sensory nerves sending signals back to the brain stem or the spinal cord, and then motor nerves going back out again. So they're going both ways. Afferent are the sensory ascending nerves, efferent descending. The somatic nervous system operates skeletal muscle. It is primarily voluntary, not entirely. There are some involuntary skeletal muscle actions, but basically soma means body, somatic moves the body, somatic nervous system, skeletal muscle. The autonomic nervous system, it does everything else. It does smooth muscle, it does cardiac muscle, it does glands, contraction of blood vessels, controlling blood pressure, all of that. And it's divided into two segments. Sympathetic is fight or flight. Everything involved with fight or flight is stimulated by the sympathetic nervous system, and everything else is suppressed by it. And the parasympathetic, which is rest and digest, it will stimulate everything in the GI tract, including liver and pancreatic function and the like, and has a tendency to suppress the fight or flight stuff. So sympathetic will speed up your heart, parasympathetic will slow it down. The neuron, again a review, the cell body is where the nucleus is, where all of the processing goes on. Dendrites bring signals into the cell body. The signals are in the form of positive ions. If you get enough positive ions coming into the cell body, it will cause you to reach a threshold at the axon hillock, at that proximal axon. It will fire, and the signal will go all the way down the axon. It'll spread out into any number of axon terminals, from just a couple to 1,000. And they will take this signal on out, this depolarization of that membrane, till it reaches the axon terminal, signals the release of the neurotransmitter, and then it will bind to the receiving cell and cause that cell to do something. Many of our main nerves, most of our nerves are myelinated, and the peripheral nervous system uses Schwann cells to myelinate it so that the signal jumps and moves 10 times as fast. In the central nervous system, it's primarily by oligodendrocytes, which are little cells that have legs that go out and myelinate a number of surrounding nerves. They make up part of the microglia, which is glue that holds the cells together. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. Same, S-A-M-E. Sensory afferent, motor efferent. And associational. So you have incoming, you have outgoing, but in a lot of cases, especially at something like a reflex arc, you have a little nerve going between them. So when it comes in, if the signal is powerful enough, it stimulates this guy that will then send a signal right back out again. And so we have a lot of associational neurons in the brain where you have incoming, outgoing, but you have to process it before there's a decision made about what to do. But also in the spinal cord and the brainstem, reflex arcs use these associational nerves. They're usually very short. The neuroglia, or microglia, the neuroglia, nerve glue, that holds, especially in the central nervous system, especially in the brain, millions and millions and millions of nerves in there, some of them very tiny, and they're all held in their the proximity to each other, the right locations, by a couple of different kinds of cells. You have astrocytes, they look like stars, oligodendrocytes, which are they hold them and also myelinate them, microglia, there's some additional cell-type structures, and these all can form tumors. So, we're going to have a glioma that we'll see. You can have either benign or cancerous gliomas, and they are these glial cells, the glue cells, going crazy. Nerves regenerate to some degree. Some nerves regenerate well, some hardly at all. When you damage a nerve, the part that's still attached to the cell body, if you like cut your arm and you cut a nerve, you've got some long axons going there and you've cut the axon. So now the signal can't get from the cell body to the axon terminals anymore. Well, the part that's still attached to the cell body is still alive. It's still getting the signals and things that it needs created in the nucleus. The part distal to that will die unless it reconnects pretty quickly. In the peripheral nervous system, primarily with myelinated nerves, the myelin sheath seems to help this out, the nerves can reattach themselves and start working again. Not always perfectly, but they do a pretty good job. So nowadays, if somebody gets their arm cut off, they can put it back on, they can line up the nerves well enough and kind of stitch them together, and they will find each other, and you can use your arm again. When I was a kid growing up, if somebody lost their arm, they just left it off because they didn't know how. They weren't good enough yet to put them back on so that they would work. But now they're actually pretty good at that. In the central nervous system, it doesn't work. Even if you attach them the best you can, the internal structures can't seem to find each other, and they'll never actually work. It's why somebody with the severed spinal cord is permanently paralyzed currently. Hopefully they'll find a way to make that work too. So distal to the injury, you get some swelling in the nerve. You get a hypertrophy of the filaments as they try desperately to beg for nutrients and oxygen and whatever, and start reaching toward the proximal end. The myelin sheath kind of breaks away, and then you start producing the substances which can recreate it. Now, if it's not close enough, the distal part will die. You'll have numbness or paralysis there for the rest of your life. If it's close enough, though, the ends will tend to find each other. Proximal to the injury, you get some swelling. Nissl substance, it's a rough endoplasmic reticulum that has lots of ribosomes on it, lots of the ability to create new proteins and new products to help the regeneration take place. Terminals, not even just one, but multiple terminals sprout out seeking the broken part. Myelinated axons in the peripheral nervous system are the only ones that are good at this. There's a little bit of regeneration in some other nerves, but pretty much right now, if it's not a myelinated peripheral axon, you're not going to get a restoration of function. So here we've broken it, and here, you know, this is starting to degenerate here, and you're starting to have changes at both ends, and now you can see these cells are growing out and reaching down, and these cells are reaching up, and they reconnect, and you make a new myelin sheath. You can see it's a little bit different. The nerve doesn't always work just as well as it did before, but sometimes it will be just as good, and other times it'll be good enough. And the nerve, which has atrophied, or the distal part, for instance, the muscle fiber that was being innervated, will atrophy dramatically, and as soon as the nerve is regenerated, it'll hypertrophy again and come back to what it was. If you wait so long that the target muscle cell, if we're talking about peripheral myelinated nerves, we're talking about skeletal muscle for the most part, then that cell will die, and then even if you get the nerve back, you don't have a muscle cell anymore. The nerve axon terminals will sometimes find another muscle cell to innervate, but if you wait long enough, you're not going to have regeneration of the muscle fiber. So this is why people in wheelchairs who have a severed spinal cord and have the money to do it will go in regularly and get electrical stimulation of their muscles in hopes of maintaining the fibers, so there'll still be some there when they get some restoration of the nerves. Okay, so that's nerve damage and restoration. Fairly straightforward. Let's go back into the central nervous system and go through the different parts of it, because we're going to have damage to different parts of the brain. We're going to see strokes that happen in certain places, and the brain is mapped out well enough that we know if you have a stroke here, what's going to happen. First, we have the thought processes in the prefrontal area, and we have the vision processes in the occipital lobe. So we know that. The auditory and gustatory stuff is close to your ears and close to the back of your tongue. So those areas are here. We have primary sensory, and then we have associational. So light comes in, then you have associational areas that tells you what you're seeing. Right? It's not just a blob, but it's a tree. And you have your primary motor cortex is here in the precentral gyrus, and the primary somatosensory area is the postcentral gyrus. So your sense, if you touch your arm, that comes in here, and the associational nerves will tell you what you're feeling, what it means. Here, if I want to send a signal out, it goes from the pyramidal tracts here. You're going to have a corticospinal pathway from the cortex to the spine and out, and your leg moves. Close to those, you have areas that help decide which ones you want to turn on. The premotor area is more precise. It's good for brain surgery and playing a guitar and stuff. Not just making your hand move, but making it move much more specifically. Frontal eye field it is the motor nerves, sets of motor nerves that cause your eyes to track properly. Broca's area, the speech area, this is for creating speech. You can understand language and you could write it out if this were damaged, but you couldn't make your mouth make the right noises. Back here we have Wernicke's area. This is a sensory, this is understanding speech. If this is broken, you could still make noise, but it would come out like a child's babble, and when somebody spoke to you, it would sound like babble. You wouldn't be able to actually understand what the words meant. Much worse, of course. Here you can learn sign language, or you can write out your message. Here you don't even know what the language means anymore. Couple other important areas in the brain, especially when we get to some of the neurological disorders. The reticular formation or reticular activating system decides how awake you are, your level of arousal, whether you're conscious, semi-conscious, unconscious, persistent vegetative state, depends on this. This has to be awake for you to be awake. Your limbic system, a series of little areas, nuclei within the midbrain and the inner part of the cortex within that controls your emotions: hate, rage, love, fear. The signals come down, they synapse, cross over, and go down. Almost all of them. A lot of them synapse in the thalamus, because if you, especially incoming stuff, you have all these sensory nerve signals coming in, and to figure out what they are and what to do about them, they have to be sent to the right part of the brain. And you can't have a separate nerve going from every nerve ending in your skin to its own cell in your brain. So all of these signals come into the thalamus. It's your switch box, and it sends the signal to the right part of your brain for you to process it appropriately. So that's a big one there. Move down a little farther, you tend to cross over and go down. If it's something that happens way up high, it hasn't crossed over yet, I damage something over here, I have an ipsilateral or same side problem. If it's down a little bit farther, it has crossed over, I bang here, I can't move my left arm. Contralateral. That's the way most of them are. And then they move down various pathways in the spinal cord. They exit wherever they're supposed to and go out and articulate or innervate some tissue outside the central nervous system. First order neurons are the first guy, second order neurons are the second guy. It's that easy. Spinal cord, again, you have cranial nerves that are coming out and not entering the spinal cord, but the spinal cord itself, the majority of your nerves go down the spinal cord and then exit. Cervical plexus, up here, a lot of sensory and some shoulder shrug and neck movements. Brachial plexus, arms, musculocutaneous nerve, elbow and wrist and finger flexion, radial nerve, elbow, wrist, and finger extension, ulnar nerve, spreading of the fingers and deviation of the hands, median nerve, most of your grip strength. This should be all review, but it's been a while perhaps. Again, my friend in Colorado, who's a rock climber and stuff, had a tumor on her radial nerve that went undiagnosed long enough. It damaged the radial nerve badly, and she couldn't open her hand. she couldn't straighten her arm very well or open her hand. And so they've done a lot of nerve splicing, and now she can do pretty well. Lumbar plexus, you have the femoral nerve coming out of there. That's a really big one. Quadriceps. Sacral plexus, sciatic nerve, comes out the back, goes down your butt, the back of your leg, your hamstrings, plantar flexion. And sensory on those same areas that it motorly innervates. In the brain and in the spinal cord, you're surrounded by the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Dura, durable on the outside, arachnoid with all the spider legs. Pia mater actually stuck to the surface itself, on the brain, all the way down the spinal cord, and then all filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Nerves come out, they synapse in ganglia, and then have a final set of nerves that goes to the target tissue. Reflex arcs, just as a reminder, signal comes in. If it comes in with sufficient power, it will generally stimulate an associational nerve or an interneuron that will turn on a motor nerve, and you can respond before it even makes it all the way to your brain. If it's in the somatic nervous system, it's a defense mechanism. So you put your hand on a hot stove, and you've actually jerked your hand off before you feel the pain here, which is a really good thing. You don't hurt yourself as badly that way. Reflex arcs in the autonomic nervous system. If you eat something, it stretches your stomach, it sends a signal, and it doesn't go to here. It goes across and goes back out, so your stomach churns, and you produce stomach acid to digest the food. And our best testing example of the reflex arc, the patellar tendon reflex. Again, you're not testing the tendon at all, but if you bang on the tendon, it jerks on the quadricep muscle, which has the neurospindle muscle fibers, muscle spindle fibers, sends back a signal, reflex arc, goes back out, and your leg kicks out. A good test of the entire pathway. The meninges, dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. We know what those are. A subdural hematoma is beneath that. A subarachnoid hematoma is beneath that. If it's subpia, it means it's in your brain, so it would be a cerebral hemorrhage then. Cerebrospinal fluid is made in the ventricles, those hollow places in your brain. They make the cerebrospinal fluid. It flows through an entire pathway down the spinal cord and then is reabsorbed as fast as it's made so pressure doesn't build up. So it's a very slow but continuous flow of this clear cerebrospinal fluid. Vertebral column, 7 cervical vertebrae, atlas on top, axis is next with the dens of the axis to rotate on. Cervical vertebrae in the neck, 12 thoracic in the thorax, where each one has a rib attached to it. So not as much movement here as you have down in the lumbar vertebrae, 5 of those. And then the sacrum is actually 5 vertebrae that are fused together. The coccyx on the bottom. Almost a liter of blood at rest goes to the brain every minute, and about almost a fifth. It's usually more like 800 mLs rather than a full liter. But it's, close to a fifth of your cardiac output. Now, if you run and your cardiac output goes up 4 or 5 times as much, your brain automatically restricts flow, so it's still only getting about 1 liter per minute. It doesn't get 5 liters per minute just because you're putting out 5 times as much. Very good auto-regulation. Carbon dioxide is the only thing that is sensed within the cerebrospinal fluid. Carbon dioxide, if it builds up, will cause you to breathe faster and your heart to beat faster to deliver blood more quickly to the brain. Comes from the common carotid, right off the top of the aortic arch, splits into the internal and external carotid arteries. Internal goes inside the brain to the circle of Willis and covers all the structures in there. The external carotid does the surface of the brain, the scalp, and so forth. Vertebral arteries come off and go down the vertebrae. So you have vertebral arteries, one going down each side, little tiny spinal arteries that go down inside those, and those actually supply blood to your spinal column and to the structures right around it. Here's the common carotid, internal going in, external coming out. External carotid does your face and your scalp and the surface of your brain. Internal carotid goes inside here to the circle of Willis and then branches out here to the internal brain structures. Here's our circle of Willis here. Vertebral arteries and spinal arteries. So the vertebral arteries come off of your primary circle of Willis and stuff, comes back down and goes down the sides of the vertebrae, spinal column. The spinal arteries actually go right inside the spinal column, at least for a certain distance, at least down the length of your neck. And then the vertebral arteries and everything kind of take over from there. When my wife's neck was broken when a truck hit her, when it lost its brakes, she broke C1 and C2 and had to have those two stabilized with screws. And they wanted to put a screw on each side to make the best stability possible. But one of her vertebral arteries was smaller than normal. And they didn't mind damaging that because there's redundancy here. These actually communicate, so this one can supply the whole thing, or this one can supply the whole thing. But they were afraid of putting a screw on both sides because if somehow they damaged the one good one, then she'd be paralyzed. If they damaged the bad one, she'd still have the good one. So they only did it on the side of the bad one. "31 pairs of spinal nerves correlate with the vertebrae from which they exit. 12 pairs of cranial nerves, you memorize those in A&P 1. Here's your cranial nerves. 3 of them go to operate the eyes, the oculomotor, abducens, and trochlear nerves operate eye muscles. Optic nerve is for vision. Olfactory nerve for smelling. Facial nerve, the anterior part of your tongue for taste, and then all your facial expressions. Trigeminal for some movement of skin up here, but largely for the temporalis and masseter muscles so that you can chew. Glossopharyngeal nerve, mostly afferent, mostly signals coming from the tongue, from the back of the throat, swallowing, gag reflex, movement of the tongue, and some taste. Vestibulocochlear nerve. Vestibulo is for balance, coming from the semicircular canals. cochlear nerve coming from the hearing mechanism. They come in together. Vagus nerves that go all the way down into the viscera and operate your entire thoracoabdominal area. Spinal accessory or accessory nerve, which helps out with shoulder shrugging and sternocleidomastoid muscles. And hypoglossal, meaning under the tongue. Under the tongue, a lot of your tongue movements and speech. So those are the cranial nerves. A super quick review of what those guys do. But if we find that we have damage to some of these nerves through diabetic myopathy or something, neuropathy, then you know what's not going to work. Peripheral nerves exit the spinal cord, synapse at a ganglion of some kind, send that last order neuron out. Myelinated nerves, for the most part, turn on skeletal muscle, receive inputs. So if you're sending a signal to this muscle, you're also going to be receiving signals from the muscle and also from the skin on top of it. Quickly, autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic, fight or flight. Norepinephrine. Norepinephrine also stimulating the adrenal gland to send out adrenaline. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, they bind to the same receptors. They do everything fight or flight. Dilate your pupils, speed up your heart, make you sweat, make you breathe faster, dilate the bronchi, raise your blood pressure. They send signals to most of your tissues, and the parasympathetic does the opposite. It will turn on the entire GI tract while turning off the other stuff. It'll constrict the pupils. It'll slow your heart rate. It will constrict the bronchi. A reminder of the neurotransmitters. Somatic nervous system, acetylcholine at skeletal muscle. Autonomic nervous system, sympathetic, norepinephrine at your alpha and beta receptors, your adrenergic receptors. Parasympathetic, acetylcholine at the muscarinic receptors, the M1s through M5s, the muscarinic type receptors. And the adrenal medulla producing epinephrine and norepinephrine to be released into the bloodstream as part of the sympathetic response. Here's just a simplified version of that. I hope you'll spend whatever time you need with this, go over it, make sure that you're pretty comfortable with all the nerve processes, where they go, where they start, what neurotransmitter they use, what receptors they use, because if we take a drug that blocks beta receptors, it's going to slow our heart down and make it relax some. You know, if we block alpha receptors, it's going to lower our blood pressure by allowing our blood vessels to relax. So we're blocking some part of the sympathetic or some part of the parasympathetic. If you need to block parasympathetic because your parasympathetic is rest and digest, maybe you're overstimulating your stomach and making too much stomach acid. You might need to do a vagotomy and actually cut the vagus nerve so it doesn't stimulate that part of the stomach so much and give you ulcers all the time. Or maybe you can block it with a muscarinic receptor blocker of some kind. Since erections are parasympathetic, if you take a parasympathetic blocker, the guy might become impotent. So there are side effects, there are possibilities, a number of possibilities to any of the procedures that we might undertake to try to solve some of the problems. we're going to see in a couple of lectures when we get to some of the nervous system problems.